Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil rights and U.S. labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It prohibits the unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 essentially disenfranchises the Jim Crow laws that were present in the South during the time of its passing. The bill was called for by President John F. Kennedy when he asked for legislation, quote, giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments, close quote, as well as, quote, greater protection for the right to vote. He was the first U.S. president to campaign and be elected on an anti-segregation stance. In his civil rights address, he said that the heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. However, after his assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald, the political situation surrounding the bill changed. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, in his first address to Congress on November 27, 1963, he told the legislators, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. After its passing, President Johnson realized that supporting the bill would risk losing the South's overwhelming support for the Democratic Party. The South, which had 5 states swing Republican in '64, became a stronghold of the Republican Party by the 1990s. Aside from the federal government, many organizations were crucial in the pursuit of civil rights for African Americans in the United States. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or SNCC, was one of the most important organizations of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It emerged from the first wave of student sit-ins and peaceful demonstrations held by Ella Baker at Shaw University in April 1960. The SNCC became a leading force for voter registration in the rural South, a region that had not been targeted by the efforts of the other major civil rights organizations. SNCC leaders put themselves in danger in areas where the KKK was unfettered and where African Americans had been under the political, legal, and economic rule of white Americans since the end of the Reconstruction after the Civil War. One of the SNCC's greatest and most remarkable projects in the Deep South was the creation of freedom schools during the Freedom Summer of 1960. The SNCC's freedom schools were intended to counter the sharecropper education received by many African Americans and poor whites in the Deep South, especially in states such as Mississippi and Alabama. Through reading, writing, math, civics, and history lessons, participants received a progressive education during a 6 to 9 week summer program that was designed to prepare disenfranchised African Americans to become active political actors on their own behalf. Nearly 40 freedom schools were established during the Freedom Summer and served close to 2,500 students in the Deep South.
There's a big psychological, gap to overcome. There's what a lot of people call a psychology of fear.
Bob Moses, educator and civil rights activist, became known for his work as a leader of the SNCC on voter education and registration in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. Moses began working with civil rights activism in 1960, becoming field secretary for SNCC. As director of SNCC's Mississippi Project in 1961, Moses traveled to counties to try to register black voters, and by 1964, he had become co-director of COFO, Council of Federated Workers, an umbrella organization for the major civil rights groups working in Mississippi. A major leader within the organization, he was the main organizer of the Freedom Summer Project, which was intended to achieve widespread voter registration of blacks in Mississippi and ultimately end racial disenfranchisement. Moses was one of the calm leaders who kept the group focused on their goal to educate the black people of the South.
It was 1964. African Americans had been given the right to vote almost 100 years earlier, yet fewer than 7% had registered, and it was no wonder.
You'd be fired from your job if you even tried to go down and register to vote. If you had a loan, any kind of loan, they would cut your loan. They would publish your name in the paper. Then there was something called the registrar who would then make you take a test, and inevitably, if you're African American, you failed.
There were many instances in which people that were against integration and against the work of the Freedom Summer Project attempted to, through intimidation and violence, end the civil rights activism in the Deep South. Perhaps the most famous of these events of violence by white supremacists was the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, which inspired the creation of the 1988 movie Mississippi Burning. On June 21, 1964, 3 young men disappeared near the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Michael Schwerner and James Cheney worked for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, in the nearby town of Meridian, Mississippi. Andrew Goodman was one of the hundreds of college students from across the country, but mostly the North, who volunteered to work on voter registration in the South. After 6 weeks of searching, a tip from an informant sent investigators to a dam on the old Jolly Farm outside Philadelphia, and it was there that the FBI uncovered the bodies of the 3 activists that disappeared the month before. After investigation, it was concluded that Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff in Neshoba County, was linked to the murders of the 3 activists. He was also a member of the White Knights of the KKK. Although he was never charged with the murders, Price was convicted in October 1967 of violating the civil rights of the 3 victims. The murder inspired the creation of Mississippi Burning, a crime thriller directed by Alan Parker. Upon its release, it became embroiled in controversy, as it was heavily criticized by African American activists involved in the civil rights movement and the families of the 3 activists for its fictionalization of history.
Take it easy, we'll be all right.
Sure you will, nigger lover.
He's seen your face. That ain't good. You don't want him seeing your face.
Oh, it don't make no difference no more.
Oh shit, we into it now, boys.
Well, you only left me a nigger, but at least I shot me a nigger.
Yes, indeed.